Thank you for coming. So mental health, in fact, affects 1 in 4 of us. And that's actually not even a statistic of an acute panic attack, but this is talking about having a mental disorder for 1 year, whether it's addiction or anxiety, schizophrenia, autism. Well, autism is pretty lifetime. But the one thing that people forget often is that these are developmental disorders, and it's really sad because I do these, young people research, or children, adolescents, in humans as well as in animals, and people go, oh, well, don't you need a adult comparison? And I said, no, you should really be asking the adult researchers, don't you need a developmental comparison? Because the reason that people think, well, a lot of the experts, including myself, think that mental health research has reached sort of, an impasse and we haven't made any progress is because we have neglected the fact that how we are treated or what we experience in childhood and adolescence really profoundly affects mental health for the rest of our lives. So this is me as a teenager. You can try to guess which one of us is me, but all Asian girls look the same at this age. I did not know that until I grew up. I'm like, wow, we do really look the same. There's actually one of my friends in the crowd. Looking back, it was a tough time. Being an adolescent really sucked. And everything that happened, I felt so much emotion. And then you remember that, these emotions are quite uncontrollable. And that's what exactly the scientists found. Let's see if I can get the laser. Maybe not. Anyway, so it was only about 10 or 17 years ago that this researcher called LeDoux found out that animals clearly show signs of being anxious or being really afraid or being fearful. And he pinpointed this structure called the amygdala, saying this is what, governs our emotions, this brain structure. And right now, we really accept it, and a lot of people readily believe this, but back then, it was extremely controversial because people thought that there's no way that such a basic brain area, so this amygdala region is a very, very basic area shared by all mammals, and there are similar structures in fish, in worms, and people did not want to believe that these fearful emotions were actually quite ubiquitous, quite everywhere in living things. And then soon after that discovery, that this amygdala structure was talking to this other cortical, what we say higher decision-making structures like the hippocampus or the prefrontal cortex, that, it was indeed that these instincts were, shared by many species. And then we showed it in humans that the amygdala was also acting in the very, very same way. So the discovery of this emotion in animals led to an explosion of studies to really understand how we become afraid or how we may be afraid from the first place. And so this is, Nobel Prize winner Pavlov, and using this principle of Pavlovian conditioning, which he used to ring a bell because what he was interested in was saliva reaction from the dog. So to remind himself to, perfectly control the experiment that every 9 a.m. I want to feed my dog, he rang this bell. And what he noticed was that initially there will be a bell, there will be food to the dog, and the food will start salivating. After many days, as soon as there was the bell, the dog would start salivating to the bell immediately. So the dog would learn that the bell would signal food, and his uncontrollable saliva reaction would just happen immediately because he knew that the bell meant food. So this is called conditioned emotional reflexes. And it's really interesting because although we understand that it's a reflex, people don't really understand what reflex means. So if you look at the Oxford Dictionary, it will say an action or a movement of the body that happens automatically as a reaction to something, or something that you do without thinking as a reaction to something. And this explains why you may be feeling all right, but something happens, and then you feel bad. That's a reflex. And this is why when someone's feeling bad or stressed or anxious, you can't just be like, just calm down, just chillax, just don't worry about it. No, we can't control it. It's a reflex. It's a conditioned emotional reflex, or it's an emotional reflex. And we know this in the lab, but oftentimes we don't afford that generosity to each other in humans, that what you feel when something bad happens is a reflex that you can't control. And yeah, understanding this and understanding that dogs or rats or fish or worms all have these emotional reflexes that we can measure, we could start unveiling what it means to have an emotional memory, and especially in my lab, a fear memory. And fear memory is important to understand because PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is actually the most common anxiety disorder in the world, and definitely in Australia as well. And 17% of adults report having PTSD for at least 6-7 months. And the thing is, people are like, well, we don't believe this. Well, people who were relatively lucky to escape any bad events, I guess, will say, I can't believe that because, not many people go to the war, and not many people go through these like super traumatic, natural disaster events. But it turns out that, physical assault, sexual trauma, so this is percentage of people reporting what caused their PTSD. And they can have more than one reasons. That's why these won't add up to 100%. I'm sure you noticed. But a lot of everyday things, transportation, that's probably a car accident, but it may be just like a horrible public transportation experience, but, can cause this really traumatic memories. And for some reason, these extreme emotions at the time will suddenly cling onto some sort of significance to things around you. For example, if you laugh at me and humiliate me, I might start to think that maybe this chair is associated with the humiliating experience, and every time I see a chair, I feel really afraid. But that's like PTSD, where things like a loud noise because of a weapon assault, because of a gunshot. Any loud noise can trigger the emotional event because emotional response, because you think that same thing is happening to your life. So, large part of my research, and what makes my research very unique, is because I actually focus on how we forget these things. Because a lot of people think, a lot of the way science and our researchers have started is that maybe when people have these things happen, the way you remember things is very different. And so people sort of try to look at biology and genetic links to what makes you more afraid than other people. But it turned out that it has nothing to do with whether you have an anxious personality or not. But a lot of whether you develop a disorder or not has to do with whether you forget or not. So some people can react just as bad to a bad news, but then, like me, can sleep and wake up and feel good. But some people, they can sleep or they can't sleep. And the next day they feel bad, and the day after they feel bad, and the day after they feel bad. So it has a lot to do with how we forget. So, emotional reflexes. So if you saw a clown in a gutter, every time you see a gutter, you might think there's going to be this really creepy clown. So this is how emotional reflexes can form. Every time you see a gutter, you start imagining this clown, you start imagining horrific things. So to forget this gutter means clown memory, scientists have devised lots of different ways to change how you feel about these things. So I think first thing we thought, at least in animals, is that we can just destroy some brain regions and then you'll forget. And this is the premise of, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. He had a traumatic heartbreak after being in love with somebody, and he decided to erase her forever. And we do this, but we shouldn't really do this in humans. One way of forgetting is lesioning your brain. But we probably shouldn't have to go that way. So second way that the scientists thought about is making a new association. So instead of like the clown being scary, you say the clown is telling you, I can make your loans disappear. I found this, I didn't make this up. I love meme culture. I'm an Imjurian, I have a problem. Anyway, so this guy goes into the gutter because the gutter now has a positive association. So this is called counter conditioning. So it's like before the gutter had a negative association, but you tried to replace that with a positive association. So that's one way that we try to regulate our emotions. But this way, it turned out, works really, really badly, and I'll talk about that later. Another way is what people have utilized what we call context-specific forgetting. So if you were, this means that whenever you encode an experience, you experience to remember something, you are best off remembering that in the similar situation. So in this was actually a real experiment. So if you were sober at your lecture, then you're better off being sober at test and your performance will increase. But if you're drunk in the light blue bar, if you're drunk at a lecture, you're much better being drunk if you want to do well at a test. So this is why when people go through a breakup or go through a traumatic situation, they want to move. And that actually seems to help because everything, your environment that surrounds you can remind you of the emotional experience. And if you change elements of your environment, it helps you to forget. So this one seems to work better than counter-conditioning. Another way is what we call trace decay. So every memory that, every experience that we have has to sort of convert into these molecules in the brain that eventually sort of changes how our neurons communicate to each other. And those molecules have similarities. And it turned out that if you get hit on the head, these molecules get disrupted, so you forget. Or if you drink a lot of alcohol, which acts on these molecules that helps you to forget, you will forget. And one of the most still effective and reliable way to treat depression is electroconvulsive therapy, where you temporarily sort of stop your brain and disrupt these molecules, and it helps you to forget. And people think that because transition from short-term to long-term memory requires these molecules, these processes actually disrupt that to help you forget. And alcohol is really interesting because I love this show. And there's I think what Job does, he uses roofie to make himself forget about traumatic experience. And these roofies are based on Flunitrazepam, which is actually acts on the similar neurotransmitter system as alcohol. It's like super concentrated alcohol to make you forget. Except that he kept forgetting that he used that to forget himself, so he kept eating more flunitrazepam and had no memory. But what my lab is most interested in and what seems to be so far effective in treating how we feel afraid seem to be cue exposure therapy. So this is based on the principle, what we call extinction, where if you're repeatedly exposed to things that you're afraid of, eventually you learn that that thing is not that dangerous or you're not going to die. So, and with the advancement of virtual reality, it has been relatively more promising that we can administer this in a very practical way. So if you're afraid of heights, you can have virtual reality to feel like you're going up an elevator, and you slowly build that up until you can choose to go up higher and higher, and lots of different phobias. But the problem is all of those counter-conditioning, even trace decay, with alcohol, whatever, and exposure therapy as well, every single one of those treatment avenues actually does not guarantee that you'll forget your fears forever. Relapse is so common that 80% of the time, if you get your fears treated, you will relapse. And in fact, it is expected as when psychologists treat the fear, your fear, that you will relapse into being afraid all of a sudden. Some things we have explanation for, but a lot of the cases that we have no idea why you relapse into being afraid again, and that it is a pattern that you'll go through this pattern of relapse and being okay, and then being afraid again and being okay. And the thing is, this pattern is actually not that different from biological diseases like cancer or diabetes. Relapse is actually very, very, very common, and especially if you get your fear treated later in life. So one of the things that I really want people to know is that it's not a failure if you relapse. It's actually very normal. You need to know that it's not because of your weakness or because of lack of experience or terrible psychotherapy you had that you relapsed. But it's because the brain is just very, very good at remembering the negative things so that you avoid those dangers, and that happen to sometimes come back all the time without any reason, not because you failed. So I want us to keep trying no matter how hard things are. Okay, thank you.